The American soldiers thought they had seen everything. They had crossed beaches covered in bodies, walked through towns smashed flat by artillery, watched friends die without warning or reason. But nothing prepared them for what waited behind the gates of Dachau, because this wasn't a battlefield. There were no trenches, no enemy charges, only silence, stacks of corpses, and a truth so unbearable that discipline collapsed in seconds. What happened next was never part of the official victory story. It wasn't taught in schools. It wasn't celebrated. It was whispered, denied, buried, and yet, it happened. This is the moment when war stopped being about orders and became about rage, shock, and human limits. April 29, 1945, Southern Germany. The war was nearly over. American troops from the U.S. 45th Infantry Division approached what intelligence reports described as a prison camp near the town of Dachau. No resistance was expected. The SS presence was believed to be minimal. The soldiers advanced cautiously, but calmly. Then they saw the train. 39 railcars sat on a siding outside the camp fence. At first, no one understood what they were looking at. The cars were sealed. No markings, no movement. One soldier climbed onto a flat car and pried open a door. Inside were bodies, not wounded, not sleeping, dead. Hundreds of them, men reduced to skin and bone, piled together like freight. Some appeared to have clawed at the walls from the inside. Others lay frozen in positions of suffocation. The smell hit next. Veterans later said it wasn't like death on the battlefield. This was different. This was rot mixed with sickness, fear, and abandonment. The soldiers stood in silence. No orders were given. None were needed. They moved forward. Beyond the train tracks stood the gates of Dachau concentration camp, the first Nazi camp ever built, now revealed at the very end of the war. As the gates opened, the full reality came into view. Rows of barracks, watchtowers, electrified fences, and prisoners, thousands of them, staring back with eyes that didn't react, didn't cheer, didn't move. Some tried to smile. Others simply collapsed. Many couldn't stand anymore. American medics ran forward instinctively, trying to help, but quickly realized the situation was beyond anything they had trained for. Starvation was so advanced that food could kill the prisoners if given too quickly. Inside the camp, more bodies lay scattered near buildings, along paths, beside bunks. Not from battle, not from bombs, from systematic neglect and murder. The soldiers began to understand. This wasn't imprisonment. This was extermination. Then they found the guards. SS personnel, some armed, some surrendering, some hiding, were still present in and around the camp. Many claimed they had only followed orders. Others insisted they had been abandoned by their command. To the American soldiers, none of that mattered anymore. Discipline began to crack, not because they were ordered to break it, but because no training prepares a human being for this. What happened next would later be called an incident, a misunderstanding, a breakdown of command, but among the men who were there, it had another name: justice, or revenge, or something darker, something that didn't have a word yet. And once the first shot was fired, there was no pulling the moment back. The SS guards didn't run at first. Some stood frozen near the watchtowers, rifles slung, faces pale. Others gathered near a maintenance yard, hands raised, trying to look small. A few attempted explanations in broken English. It was not us. We had orders. The camp was already like this. The American soldiers didn't answer. They walked past the guards and deeper into Dachau. They saw the crematorium. The ovens were still warm. Ash lay scattered on the ground. Human ash, tracked through the mud by boots that had marched here for years without mercy. Inside nearby rooms were bodies stacked with a precision that made it worse. This wasn't chaos. This was organization. One soldier vomited and kept walking. Another soldier sat down and stared at nothing. A third picked up a shovel from the ground and stared at it for a long time, as if trying to remember why such a thing existed. Behind them, the SS guards were still standing there, alive. That contrast, the dead and the breathing standing side by side, snapped something. Orders came in late and unclear. Secure the camp. Disarm the guards. Hold positions, but command structures rely on belief. And belief had just burned away. Near the coal yard, a group of SS guards was herded together. Some were teenagers, some older. Their uniforms were dirty, their insignia half removed, as if that could undo what they were. An American officer attempted to take control. Weapons down, prisoners of war. No reprisals. His voice was steady, but around him, the soldiers' faces weren't. They had just seen what the guards had protected, what they had enforced, what they had walked past every day. Someone shouted. No one remembers who. Another soldier raised his weapon, not in panic, not by accident, but with deliberate anger. The first shot echoed unnaturally loud. It wasn't part of a battle. It wasn't returned. It was a breaking point. The SS guards flinched. Some fell to the ground. Others screamed. A few tried to run and were stopped almost immediately. Officers rushed forward, shouting commands, trying to regain control. Some soldiers obeyed. Some didn't. For a few minutes, no one can agree how many the rules of war simply stopped functioning. Not everywhere. Not across the camp. But right there, in that yard, surrounded by evidence of industrial murder. Later, official reports would call it a tragic but isolated incident. Later, investigations would soften language and remove detail. Later, blame would be shifted, absorbed, forgotten. But in that moment, none of that existed. Only the raw truth that justice had arrived too late for thousands, and far too suddenly for a few dozen. When it ended, silence returned, thicker than before. The surviving SS guards were taken away. The prisoners watched from behind fences, many too weak to react. Some later said they felt nothing. Others said they finally felt safe, for the first time in years. American commanders sealed the area. Photographs were taken. Statements collected. And then, almost immediately, the narrative was controlled. Because victory stories don't include moments like this. They don't include the cost of seeing evil up close. They don't include what happens when men trained for combat encounter proof of systematic cruelty. But Dachau was not finished revealing what it would take from those who entered it. Because the soldiers would have to live with this moment long after the war ended, and history would decide, quietly, how much of it the world was allowed to remember. By the afternoon of April 29th, word had spread beyond the fences of Dachau. Not through radio reports, not through official channels, through faces. Soldiers arriving as reinforcements took one look at the camp and immediately understood that something irreversible had already happened. No one needed to explain the bodies on the train. No one needed to explain the smell. But what did need explanation was the tension still hanging in the air, thick, unstable, unfinished. Officers began moving quickly now. Not to undo what had happened, because that was impossible, but to contain it. SS survivors were transferred out of sight. Weapons were confiscated from American troops who were visibly shaken. Orders were repeated louder, slower, with no room for interpretation. This was no longer just a liberation. It was a potential scandal, because under the Geneva Conventions, surrendered enemy soldiers, even SS, were prisoners of war. What happened in that coal yard sat in a dangerous gray zone between battlefield chaos and deliberate reprisal. And Washington would never accept the second version. An investigation began almost immediately. Statements were taken. Timelines reconstructed. Language softened. Words like execution were replaced with confusion. Words like reprisal became breakdown of command. The reality was more uncomfortable. Multiple units had arrived at Dachau from different directions. Not all witnessed the same events. Not all reacted the same way. Some soldiers protected SS guards from harm. Others turned away. A few openly intervened to stop the shooting. There was no single moment, no single decision, just a chain reaction triggered by human limits finally being exceeded. Higher command reviewed the findings, and then they made a choice. No court-martials, no public trials, no press coverage. The incident would be acknowledged internally, but never emphasized. The war was still ongoing. The liberation of camps was unfolding across Europe. The last thing Allied command wanted was a narrative that blurred moral lines. So Dachau became remembered for its victims, not for what happened to its guards. The soldiers involved returned to duty. Some were commended later for bravery elsewhere. Others carried something heavier, because unlike combat, this hadn't been a moment of adrenaline. It had been a moment of recognition. Many veterans later said Dachau was the day the war finally became personal. Not when they were shot at, not when they lost friends, but when they saw what hatred looked like after years of unchecked power. Years later, during interviews and private letters, some admitted they felt no regret. Others said they did, but not in the way people expected. They regretted that it had come to that. They regretted that no one had stopped the camp sooner. They regretted that justice, when it finally arrived, looked nothing like justice at all. One soldier wrote, "I didn't feel proud. I didn't feel ashamed. I felt empty. Like something human had been burned out of all of us." Dachau did not end that day. The camp had to be stabilized. Prisoners had to be fed slowly, carefully, many dying anyway from the damage already done. Doctors worked around the clock. Graves were dug for the dead who had survived long enough to be freed, but not long enough to be saved. And every night, American soldiers stood guard in a place that had once existed to destroy everything they believed in. Some dreamed of gunfire. Some dreamed of silence. None of them forgot, because Dachau was not just a crime scene. It was a mirror, and not everyone liked what they saw reflected back. For the prisoners of Dachau, liberation did not arrive like a celebration. It arrived like a confusion they no longer trusted. When the shooting ended and the SS guards were gone, the gates stood open, but many prisoners didn't move. Years of punishment had trained them not to react to sudden changes. Sudden kindness had always been followed by cruelty. Some believed it was a trick. Others were too weak to stand. Those who did step forward didn't cheer. They stared at the American soldiers with hollow curiosity, as if trying to decide whether these new men were real, or just another nightmare wearing a different uniform. Doctors quickly realized the situation was catastrophic. Starvation had altered bodies beyond recognition. Muscles had wasted away. Organs had shrunk. Immune systems were gone. Simple food could cause death if given too quickly. So freedom had to be rationed. Slow sips of broth, measured spoonfuls of milk, careful steps into sunlight that burned eyes unaccustomed to hope. Some prisoners asked one question again and again. Are they gone for good? Not, are we free? Because freedom meant nothing if the guards could return. American soldiers began escorting survivors through the camp, documenting what they found. Prisoners pointed silently to rooms, buildings, yards, places where things had happened that words could not explain. The soldiers listened, and the more they learned, the heavier the atmosphere became. Stories of roll calls that lasted hours in freezing weather. Punishments that escalated without reason. Men beaten for falling down because they were too weak to stand. The guards who had been shot were not spoken about much. The prisoners did not celebrate their deaths. They had learned long ago that joy was dangerous. Instead, many expressed something quieter. Relief, not revenge. Not hatred, just relief that the system had stopped breathing. Some American soldiers expected gratitude. What they received instead was silence and exhaustion. And slowly, they understood something important. Liberation did not erase trauma. It simply changed its shape. As days passed, mass burials began. For those who had died just before liberation, and those who could not survive the sudden shift from starvation to care. American troops helped dig graves alongside survivors, turning the camp itself into evidence that could not be denied. Photographers documented everything, because this time, the world had to see. But even as evidence was gathered, another truth settled in. The moment of violence against the SS guards, brief, chaotic, uncontrolled, had become part of the camp's story too. And that made people uncomfortable. Because Dachau forced a question no one wanted to ask out loud. What happens when the line between justice and revenge collapses under the weight of proof? For the prisoners, the answer didn't matter. What mattered was that the gates stayed open, that the uniforms were gone, that the shouting had stopped. For the soldiers, the question followed them home. And for history, Dachau became something else entirely. Not just a symbol of Nazi crimes, but a warning about what prolonged cruelty can do to victims, to witnesses, and to those sent to stop it. Within days of Dachau's liberation, the camp stopped being just a military objective. It became evidence. American commanders understood something immediately. If the truth wasn't recorded now, it could be denied later. So cameras were brought in. Journalists followed. Military photographers documented everything with brutal precision. The train cars, the crematorium, the barracks, the bodies that had not lived long enough to see the gates open. There was no narration meant to soften it, no attempt to frame it as propaganda, just proof. Footage from Dachau would soon be shown to politicians, judges, and eventually civilians back home, many of whom still believed reports of concentration camps had been exaggerated or invented. Dachau ended that argument. American soldiers were ordered to guide visitors, officers, reporters, Allied officials through the camp exactly as they had found it. Nothing cleaned, nothing hidden. Some visitors walked out in silence. Others broke down. A few refused to continue. One American chaplain later said the camp felt like a place where God had been locked outside. As evidence spread, Dachau became central to something much larger than itself. The idea of war crimes trials was no longer theoretical. Now there were names, faces, places, and Dachau was the blueprint. The surviving SS personnel, those not killed during liberation, were arrested, interrogated, and held for trial. Guards, administrators, doctors. Some claimed ignorance. Some admitted nothing. Some tried to shift blame upward, but the evidence didn't care. The camp itself testified. In late 1945, the Dachau trials began, one of the first war crimes tribunals held by the United States. Witnesses included survivors, former prisoners, and American soldiers who had entered the camp that day. What they described shocked even hardened investigators. Systematic beatings, medical experiments, executions carried out as routine. And yet, something was missing from the courtroom narrative. The moment of violence during liberation. The coal yard. The shots fired by American soldiers. It was not denied outright, but it was not emphasized. It was not explored. It was treated as an unfortunate footnote. overshadowed by crimes on a scale that made comparison almost obscene. Because history needed clarity, good and evil, victims and perpetrators. And Dachau already contained enough horror without complicating the story further. For the soldiers who had been there, this silence was understood. Not agreed upon, but understood. They didn't speak about that moment publicly. Some never spoke about Dachau at all. Others spoke only of what they saw, not what they did. Because explaining it required admitting something uncomfortable, that even liberators can be pushed beyond the boundaries they were trained to respect. That atrocity doesn't end cleanly, and that sometimes the truth is too heavy to carry in full view. Dachau became a warning etched into history, not just about what happens when hatred is allowed to organize itself, but about how close the edge really is when human beings finally see what other human beings have done. For many of the American soldiers who walked through Dachau, the war did not end in Europe. It ended somewhere quieter, years later, or not at all. They went home as liberators. They were welcomed as heroes. They were thanked for what they had stopped, but no one asked them what they had seen. In letters sent home shortly after the liberation, soldiers struggled to explain Dachau without really explaining it. They wrote about a prison camp, about very sick people, about things you wouldn't believe. Most left it there, because how do you describe a place where death had been routine? How do you explain the moment when rules collapsed because reality became unbearable? Some soldiers tried to forget. They focused on work, on families, on building lives far away from Europe. But memories don't fade just because you refuse to look at them. Nightmares were common, not of gunfire or battle, but of silence, of standing in the camp and realizing too late that what you're seeing is real, of faces that don't accuse but don't forgive either. Others found themselves haunted by a different thought, not what the SS guards had done, but what they themselves had been capable of doing. Given the right moment, the right trigger, the right shock, that realization unsettled them more than anything else. One veteran later said, "I always thought I knew where my line was. Dachau taught me that lines move." Psychologists would later recognize this as moral injury, damage done not by fear, but by witnessing or participating in events that violate deeply held beliefs about right and wrong. At the time, there was no name for it. Just silence. A few soldiers did speak, years later, often near the end of their lives. In interviews, they were careful, precise. They avoided dramatic language. They didn't justify. They didn't condemn. They simply described a moment when training failed and humanity took over, with all its flaws intact. Meanwhile, Dachau itself changed. The camp was converted into a memorial. Survivors returned, not to relive the trauma, but to ensure it was not forgotten. School groups walked the grounds. Guides spoke calmly, factually, deliberately. The coal yard was rarely mentioned, not because it didn't matter, but because the larger lesson needed to remain clear. Dachau was a crime committed over years, not minutes. Its victims numbered in the tens of thousands. Its purpose was destruction, not chaos. The brief violence at liberation did not define the camp, but it did reveal something uncomfortable. That even in the moment of victory, the human cost of confronting absolute evil can spill over, messy, imperfect, and deeply unsettling. History prefers clean endings. Dachau did not offer one. As years passed, Dachau became more than a location. It became a symbol. A single name that carried the weight of every camp, every transport, every unmarked grave scattered across Europe. When people said Dachau, they were no longer just talking about a place near Munich. They were talking about the proof that denial was impossible. But symbols are selective. They preserve what the world can face and quietly set aside what complicates the lesson. Official memorials focused on the victims, the survivors, the machinery of oppression. They had to. Because Dachau's greatest responsibility was to stand as evidence of Nazi crimes, not as a study of Allied moral failure. Anything that distracted from that risked being used by deniers, distorters, and those eager to blur responsibility. So the story was simplified, not falsified but narrowed. Liberation was presented as order restored, justice resumed, evil defeated. And for most people that was enough. But for historians, fragments remained. Contradictions in reports. Witness statements that didn't align perfectly. Moments where language became careful, too careful. The truth lingered in footnotes, in interviews conducted decades later, in letters never sent, in silence between sentences. The incident at Dachau during liberation was not erased, but it was contained, treated as an exception so extreme that it could not be allowed to define anything else. And perhaps that was the point, because Dachau was never meant to be a story about American soldiers losing control. It was a story about what happens when a system is built to remove empathy and succeeds. Yet the liberation added a final, uncomfortable layer, that even those sent to stop evil are still human, still capable of breaking, still vulnerable to the shock of truth. This doesn't diminish what was found at Dachau. It deepens it. It shows that prolonged cruelty doesn't just destroy its victims, it poisons the moral ground for everyone who touches it. The camp didn't end when the gates opened. It ended slowly, in testimonies, in trials, in memory, and in a quiet understanding that no victory is ever pure when it arrives too late for so many. After Dachau, the war did not slow down. Armies kept moving. Orders kept coming. The machinery of victory rolled forward. But for those who walked through that camp, time fractured. Some soldiers returned to their units and never spoke of it again. Others tried, only to find there were no words strong enough, no listener prepared enough. How do you explain the smell of death that doesn't leave your clothes? How do you describe seeing a human being reduced to a number, then realizing even numbers had run out? History prefers clean lines, dates, battles, casualty counts. Dachau refused to fit neatly. The liberation was celebrated, as it should have been. Photographs were published. Newsreels played in American theaters. Citizens watched in disbelief as piles of bodies appeared on screens thousands of miles away. The images shocked a nation and hardened its resolve that the war had been necessary. But the moments after liberation were treated differently, not denied, not prosecuted aggressively, but quietly absorbed. Investigations into alleged misconduct were brief. Statements were taken. Context was emphasized. No sweeping charges followed, not because nothing happened, but because what happened existed in a moral gray zone few were willing to stand inside. The world needed clarity. Germany had committed crimes on an industrial scale. The camps were the ultimate proof. Anything that complicated that narrative risked shifting focus from the perpetrators to the moment of reckoning, and that was unacceptable. So memory was curated. Museums showed the barracks, the ovens, the documents. They rarely lingered on the chaos of Liberation Day beyond the gates opening and prisoners collapsing into freedom. Because Dachau's purpose was to warn future generations, not to interrogate every human reaction it triggered. And yet, history is not a courtroom transcript. It is a living record shaped by fear, guilt, and necessity. As decades passed, survivors spoke more freely. So did soldiers, often near the ends of their lives when silence no longer protected anyone. What emerged was not a story of villains and heroes colliding cleanly, but a portrait of humans pushed past the limits of restraint by what they had been forced to witness. No medals were revoked. No monuments were torn down. Instead, a quiet consensus formed. Dachau was the place where evil was revealed so completely that even those who came to stop it were changed forever. Not corrupted, but scarred. History chose to remember Dachau as proof of Nazi horror. But beneath that memory lies another lesson, less comfortable and far more fragile. That justice delayed long enough does not arrive clean. That liberation can still carry guilt. And that confronting absolute evil can fracture even the strongest moral framework. The question was never whether Dachau should be remembered. It was how much of it the world was ready to face. Long after the war ended, Dachau continued killing. Not bodies. Certainty. It haunted courtrooms, classrooms, and memorials. Not as a single event, but as an unanswered question that refused to stay buried. What happens after evil is stopped? The soldiers who liberated Dachau went home as victors. Parades were held. Flags waved. Medals pinned. Families hugged men they believed had survived hell and come back whole. But Dachau followed them. Some woke in the night hearing doors slam that weren't there. Others flinched at the smell of burning wood. Many never spoke about the camp, not because they were ordered to stay silent, but because speaking meant reliving the moment when morality stopped feeling solid. A few tried to confess what they saw, what they felt, what they did or didn't stop. Most listeners weren't ready. The post-war world wanted heroes, not complications. America was rebuilding Europe, prosecuting Nazis, drawing a moral line between democracy and tyranny. Dachau stood as evidence that the line had been real, justified, necessary. But for the men who stood inside the camp, that line had blurred, not politically, but personally. Years later, as war crime tribunals concluded, survivors of Dachau were asked to testify. They spoke of starvation, beatings, executions, of friends who disappeared overnight, of guards who treated murder like routine labor. Their testimonies were precise, controlled, relentless. Then came quieter voices, American veterans interviewed by historians, journalists, grandchildren. They described something different. Not orders, not strategy, but a moment where the mind simply broke under the weight of what it had witnessed. Some said they felt no regret. Some said they felt only exhaustion. Some said Dachau destroyed their belief that humans could be divided cleanly into good and evil. One veteran put it simply, I learned that day that there are things you can never unsee, and once you see them, you don't get to choose who you become afterward. Dachau forced the world to confront an uncomfortable truth. Stopping evil does not guarantee purity. Justice does not arrive untouched by anger. And liberation is not always gentle. As decades passed, Dachau became a memorial site. School children walked through barracks. Tour guides spoke softly. Plaques emphasized remembrance, responsibility, and the warning etched into history: never again. But never again isn't a spell. It's a burden, because Dachau proves that when systems collapse and morality is shredded, even righteous causes can leave stains that time cannot fully wash away. That does not make the liberators villains. It makes them human, and perhaps that is the most dangerous lesson Dachau offers. Not that monsters existed, but that ordinary people, placed in impossible circumstances, can be forced to confront parts of themselves they never knew were there. Dachau did not end when the gates opened. It ended only when people were willing to look at it honestly. And even now, the question remains: quiet, uncomfortable, unresolved. If you had stood there that day, what would you have done? Dachau stands quiet now. Grass grows where ash once fell. Birds pass over watchtowers that no longer scan for escape. The gates still bear the words that once mocked the dying, but now they face visitors who walk through freely, carrying cameras, questions, and silence. But history does not end at the fence. After Dachau, the world said it wanted justice. Trials were held, documents stacked high, witnesses spoke until their voices broke, names were recorded, sentences delivered, yet no verdict ever felt complete, because Dachau wasn't a crime committed by one man, or even one nation. It was a system, engineered, staffed, obeyed. A machine that worked because thousands chose to follow orders, look away, or convince themselves that cruelty was normal. And then, one day, that machine met men who had seen too much death to feel fear anymore. The liberation of Dachau did not deliver a clean ending. It delivered a mirror. In that mirror, the world saw something it struggled to accept: that even righteous anger can become uncontrollable, that moral certainty collapses when faced with industrialized evil, that justice, when delayed too long, mutates into something darker. For the American soldiers, there was no ceremony inside the camp. No speech prepared them for what they found. No manual explained how to react when humanity itself appeared to have failed. They did not arrive as philosophers. They arrived as exhausted men at the edge of endurance. History often asks whether what happened next was right or wrong, but Dachau does not answer that question. It asks a harder one: how much evil can a human witness before something inside them snaps? The survivors of the camp carried trauma for the rest of their lives. The liberators carried it too, just shaped differently. Both groups understood the same truth. Dachau didn't just kill bodies. It damaged the idea that the world made sense. In later years, many veterans avoided the topic altogether. Others returned to the memorial, standing silently where chaos once ruled, searching not for forgiveness, but for understanding. They found none, because Dachau does not offer closure. It offers responsibility. A responsibility to remember that cruelty grows when it is normalized. That obedience without conscience is lethal. That hatred, once unleashed, does not stay neatly contained. And most importantly, that history is not a story about them. It is a warning about us. Every generation believes it would act differently. Every generation is certain it would recognize the signs in time. Dachau exists to challenge that belief, not as a tale of victory, not even as a tale of justice, but as proof that when humanity falls far enough, even those who come to stop it are forever changed. The gates closed that day, but the lesson never did. This was not just a war story. It was a record of what happens when the limits of human morality are pushed beyond breaking. History is not meant to comfort us. It is meant to warn us, because the most terrifying truth of Dachau is not what happened there, but how easily it became possible. If this story stayed with you, disturbed you, or made you question what you thought you understood about war and justice, then its purpose remains alive. This is Dark War Records, where history is not glorified. It is confronted. Remember what happened. Remember why it mattered. And never forget how fragile humanity can be, even in the moment it believes it is doing the right thing.